Sure can.
Oh, fabulous. Right, okay. Firstly, thank you to Tracy for arranging this meeting and also inviting me to come and talk to you about perfectionism. Um, it's an area in which I've been working all the way back to my PhD, actually, that I started in 2005. And this presentation really reflects some of the things that I've learned about perfectionism, and I've tried to package them in a way that kind of debunks some of the misconceptions and myths around perfectionism that are partly propagated by a misunderstanding of what perfectionism is, but also fueled by sometimes confusing and contradictory research findings. So I'll try to unpack some of these issues, and hopefully at the end of the presentation you'll have a much better understanding about what perfectionism is, how the research works, and why I have the opinion that perfectionism, while it may have some benefits some of the time for some athletes, the majority of the time, for the majority of athletes, it's likely to be problematic. So as Tracy mentioned there, I direct a motivation and performance and wellbeing group. We're very much interested in a broad range of phenomena that kind of sit at the juncture between motivational issues, performance issues, and well-being issues, and why for some people they're able to produce optimum performance at no cost to their well-being, whereas for some athletes, high levels of performance seems to come with some kind of psychological toll, has a negative impact on them. So I'll be presenting some of their work as well as along with some of my own. And if you see any research findings that are of interest, my university, York St John University, has a repository where we upload our papers. So that's called Ray. So if you just type in Ray, YSJU, it will take you to the page that you see on the screen now, and you'll be able to download much of the research that I talk about. And if for any reason you can't because it's embargoed, just send me an email directly and I'll more than happily share that work with you. So what I thought I'd start with is a kind of gentle introduction to how this area of research really works from kind of a methodological perspective. Some of the stats and analyses I'll present later on will look a little bit fancy, but they can all be broken down into studying relationships between variables. So what do I mean by that, studying relationships between variables? So I just went on to the internet, Wikipedia actually, and downloaded the sprint times for the 100-meter world record, and then the dates at which those world records were achieved. And then I plotted them on a graph with time on the y-axis and the date on the x-axis, and you can see here that there's a negative relationship between sprint time performance and the date at which it occurred. So in other words, as time has gone on, people have become faster from a 100-meter perspective. So this is all what we really do from a psychological perspective. We take two variables and we plot them against each other. And we can take those variables from a range of places. They could be self-report instruments, so questionnaires, so we can ask people questions and we kind of total up their scores. It could also be performance times, how far you can jump, how fast you can run. And it can also be kind of physiological biomarkers of stress, like cortisol, for example. But the fundamental principle is the same. You know, we take two variables, we correlate them with each other, we create a nice slope, which we call B, and we work out what the relationship between those two variables are, so the strength and the direction. The problem we have is that different things are measured in different ways, so they have different metrics. So here I correlated how fast people were running with the date, the chronological date. But we could also correlate how fast people were running with the age of the athlete or the height of the athlete. but that would change the unit to centimeters and how old they were. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to convert it onto a standardized metric called a correlation coefficient that in some ways is metric free, and it ranges from -1 to +1. So that allows us to compare the relationship between different variables across studies. So in relation to the research that I'm sharing, the vast majority of it is questionnaire based. So we measure or attempt to measure perfectionism and correlate it with a whole range of different things. So what do we mean by perfectionism? Well, the most widely used, kind of commonly accepted definition of perfectionism is perhaps the Randy Frost definition from 1990, where he argues that perfectionism is a combination of excessively high standards and overly critical evaluations of behavior. There are other definitions, but as I say, this is probably the most widely used and accepted. It's quite a broad definition, but it captures these two hierarchical qualities of being perfectionistic. The two key words here from this definition is excessive and overly. So the high standards aren't just high, they're not just exceptionally high, they are excessive. And by excessive, we mean that they don't take into account situational or personal constraints. And to some degree, you might expect them to be disproportionate or unnecessary given the situation. In terms of overly critical, we mean overly in terms of how frequent, how intense that criticism is. And it tends to be criticism directed towards the self rather than towards the performance. So as I say, excessively high standards, overly critical evaluations. So how do we measure these? As I say, we use self-report instruments. There's a lot of self-report instruments, some of which I'll touch upon in a minute. But it's simply the case of asking people, as you would do for any other similar psychological construct. So some of the example items on the board there are from the instruments that we use. So we might ask an athlete or a coach, to what degree do they agree with the statement, I demand nothing less than perfection of myself? And then they normally rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. And then we have a number of items and we total them all up. And then that's normally the variable we use on the x-axis, and we measure something else on the y-axis. And we build these pictures or maps of the relationships between perfectionism and a range of other factors. So that's what it is and how it kind of works. Now, briefly, I think it's worth pausing on why it's so interesting to study perfectionism in sport rather than other contexts. And I think there are a number of reasons why perfectionism is particularly interesting in sport. I think sport is actually quite perfectionistic. Perfectionism has a reverence in sport, it's valued in sport. Lots of successful athletes identify themselves as perfectionists, some of which are on the slide there from their autobiographies. In sports, perfection can exist as an objective goal. So the kind of perfect round in golf, the maximum break in snooker, the golden set in tennis. So sport is quite unusual in that regard. It's much more difficult to identify what the perfect romantic partner would be like. Or at least in some workplaces, what perfect workplace performance looks like. But in sport, it can be quite clear and quite transparent. And of course, at some levels of sport, perfection might actually be required to be successful. So in some ways, not only is perfectionism revered, it's also kind of legitimized by the structures in sport. So I think it is quite a unique context in which to study perfectionism or being perfectionistic. So that brings us nicely onto some of the myths about perfectionism. And what I would say is that, unfortunately, much of what people think they know about perfectionism is largely incorrect. And in some instances, this misunderstanding is due to, as I said, researchers and practitioners. So I'm going to try and separate out some of the myths using empirical evidence and, in some cases, more reasoned arguments against some of the myths. So the first myth I want to talk about is that perfectionism is just about personal standards. And this is what we normally think about when we talk about perfectionism. That it's about the standards that individual athletes have or that you have for yourself. But we've known for a long time perfectionism is actually multidimensional. This is a very popular model of perfectionism developed by Gordon Flett and Paul Hewitt at York University and the University of British Columbia in Canada. And they argue to study perfectionism, you have to understand the direction of the perfectionistic standards. So they have something called self-oriented perfectionism, which is probably most similar to what people typically think about with regards to perfectionism. So that's when you demand perfection from yourself and you're critical towards yourself. But they also argue that we should also be studying perfectionism from the perspective that it can be imposed on other people. So this is called other-oriented perfectionism. So this is when you demand perfection from other people and you're critical of other people. And then they also have a final dimension called socially prescribed perfectionism. This is where you believe that other people are demanding of you with regards to your performances and how you are and how you look and how you behave, and are critical of you. Now, that typically is described as the generalized other. So it doesn't have to be anyone in particular. It's a sense of oppressive other people expect of you. However, it could also reflect specific others like parents, like coaches, like partners, like teammates. So you can already see if we just focus on personal standards, we're going to miss out on understanding the consequences of being perfectionistic, particularly in relation to others, interpersonal elements of perfectionism. So if you wanted to measure or use Gordon Flett and Paul Hewitt's approach, we've actually developed an instrument that allows you to measure what we call performance perfectionism. So that's self-oriented perfectionism, other-oriented perfectionism, and socially prescribed perfectionism as it relates to athletic performance. So you can go and get this scale. It's quite short. It's only 12 items, 4 questions per subscale. And I like to think we did a pretty good job of validating it. 5 samples, 1,200 junior athletes. So there is an instrument there if you want to understand perfectionism from that perspective. The other most popular approach was developed by Randy Frost. Quite inconveniently, it's also called the multidimensional perfectionism scale. But in this instance, not only do they measure personal standards, but they also measure things like an over concern of mistakes, doubts about action, parental expectations, parental criticism, and organization. So you can see standards is, again, only one part of the picture, and it's really the concerns over mistakes that Randy Frost has argued helps distinguish perfectionism from other achievement-related characteristics. So not only would you miss out on other interesting aspects of perfectionism, according to Randy Frost, you might be missing out on the most important elements of perfectionism if you were to ignore these other characteristics. Again, there is a sport-specific measurement model of Randy Frost's approach that was developed by John Dunn and John Gottwals at Alberta University and Thunder Bay University in Canada. So they retain personal standards. They've got concern about mistakes, doubts about action. They collapse parental criticism and expectations just into parental pressure. They've got coach pressure, and they've also got organization. So again, there's an opportunity there to study perfectionism as a multidimensional construct in sport, and to capture all these other interesting qualities and ask ourselves, what are these interesting qualities related to, in addition to personal standards? Now, it's actually quite a difficult area to navigate in terms of selecting instruments and models, because there's so many. I've divided them up there on the slide into unidimensional, which is where you just measure total perfectionism. Very few people advocate just measuring total perfectionism scores. And then we've got kind of a first wave of multidimensional measurements, which are provided by Frost and Hewitt and Flett. And then we've got a second wave of multidimensional measures that came a little later. So if you first come to this literature, as I say, it can be initially quite daunting, and selecting the right instrument can be quite challenging, and each has weaknesses and strengths. So the way it's been described by Campbell and DePaula is that you should think about perfectionism as a constellation of beliefs, and that when you select out a particular model or measure, you're just selecting from that constellation. So you can see here, we could select the Hewitt and Flett approach, or we could select the Frost approach. And each time you're selecting from these this map of potential perfectionistic qualities. If you're not kind of satisfied with this kind of analogy, there is some strong empirical evidence from work that has looked at the underpinning structures of the instruments that are used. So what we call that factor structure. So you ask yourself, what underpinning broader dimensions are evident across these instruments? And what actually happens is you get two clusters, really. You get one set of subscales move to kind of to coalesce with each other, and you get another set of subscales that coalesce with each other. And these have been given various different labels, but the most common are perfectionistic strivings and perfectionistic concerns. And they map really nicely to the Frost definition that I provided earlier on. You've got the kind of commitment to excessively high standards, and then you also have the evaluative concerns. So it's really the factor structure of the instruments and something we call functional homogeneity, which is the subscales tend to behave similar if they're indicative of perfectionistic strivings, and they tend to behave similar if they're indicative of perfectionistic concerns. That means we have support for this hierarchical or higher order model of perfectionism. And so that's what this kind of looks like. We could be thinking we're measuring using different instruments. We could think we're measuring just perfectionism overall, but in fact, it's figure 3 that we get most support for, which is this idea that no matter what instrument you're measuring, you tend to be capturing perfectionistic strivings or perfectionistic concerns. So just to recap that myth, if we focus just on perfectionistic standards, we miss out on many of the other aspects of perfectionism, in particular some aspects that you would consider core aspects to understanding perfectionism, what its consequences are, and importantly, how it is different to other similar achievement-related characteristics. So the next myth I would like to focus on is that perfectionists exist. Perfectionists don't exist. And what I mean by this is that there is no level of perfectionism on the instruments that we have that would allow us to conclude that one person is a perfectionist and another person is not. There are no kind of cutoff values, and there are no opportunities to create a typology of different types of perfectionists. Now, the kind of foundation for the idea that perfectionists exist is largely based on the tripartite model of perfectionism. So this was partly grounded in work in the late 80s by Don Hamachek. It was introduced into educational psychology by Wayne Parker and then popularized by Ken Rice. And then it was moved into sport by John Dunn and colleagues. So you will find research that has examined the tripartite model of perfectionism. And within this model, they argue that you should study, or you can study, healthy perfectionists. So these are people who have high strivings and low concerns, or you can study unhealthy perfectionists. These are the people with high strivings and high concerns, and you can kind of compare them to non-perfectionists. Now, I think there are a number of problems with this model that mean it's not a good basis to study perfectionism. Some of these criticisms I've provided in the past with colleagues. One in a short review where we kind of advocate for the we advocate for abandoning the tripartite model in sport, and then a little bit in an edited book as well. To summarize the concerns I have about the tripartite model is that there are, at that point of writing those reviews, only 9 studies had taken place in sport and dance using the tripartite model, and 6 were unsupportive. So 6 of them found alternative group structures. So they weren't finding healthy perfectionists and unhealthy perfectionists and non-perfectionists. They were finding much more kind of heterogeneous groups. So we're finding kind of doubt-orientated perfectionists or kind of parental pressure-orientated perfectionists. So I think the empirical evidence is not strong. The statistical tests that they use are normally exploratory. And so what I mean by that is that it's not always easy or objective when you're trying to distinguish between what groups and the number of groups exist. And I guess my main concern is that it's a descriptive structure that is imposed on the data that assumes a typology. It assumes that there are different types of perfectionists, when I think there is no evidence for the idea that perfectionism exists as a typology. Now, in order to decide whether or not a personality characteristic exists as a typology or as a continuum, so from high to low or types of people, you have to do something called taxometric analyses. And there's only one study that has ever looked at perfectionism using taxometric analyses. And I've put their conclusion on the slide there. It says, thus it appears that the heterogeneity in perfectionism is best conceptualized as reflecting quantitative rather than qualitative differences. In other words, individual differences in perfectionism are reflective of a difference in degree rather than type of perfectionism. So what they're arguing there is that the taxometric analyses revealed that perfectionism is best thought of as something that exists in everyone to some degree, from low to high, rather than identifying specific types of people. Now, it would actually be very surprising if perfectionism existed as a typology, because very few personality characteristics do exist as a typology. So this is the largest review of personality and psychopathology variables that I could find. It's from 2012, and it was massive. 177 articles, 311 distinct findings, and what they concluded is the review indicates that the most latent variables of interest to psychiatrists and personality and clinical psychologists are dimensional, and that may influence taxonomic findings. So what are we saying here? We're saying that most personality characteristics are continuum based, are dimensional as opposed to typological. So if perfectionists don't exist, then we're best to think of and talk about being perfectionistic. Now, it's a hard habit to break, talking about perfectionists. And in some ways, if we can trust ourselves to realize when we're talking about perfectionists, what we're really saying are, or what we're really trying to describe, are people who typically score high on perfectionism, then we could more or less continue to use it. But I think what would be better is if we moved away from the label perfectionist and we just start talking about being perfectionistic and studying the consequences of being perfectionistic. So how common is it to be perfectionistic? That's the more interesting question, I think. And there's a really interesting study by Joachim Stobar at Kent University that just asked students and a community-based sample recruited from the internet what domains or areas of their life were they perfectionistic. And the findings are on the slide here. So you can see that 58% of the student sample indicated they were perfectionistic in work, 54% indicated body hygiene, 43% in their studies, and so on and so forth. And then the same for the internet sample, 53% were in the workplace, 36% bodily hygiene, 41% studies, and so forth. The main and interesting finding of this study is that only 4% of the student sample and only 8% of the internet sample reported that there was no area of their life in which they were perfectionistic. So the vast majority of the people in these samples had an area of their life that they reported they thought they were perfectionistic. So what are the implications? The implications are that perfectionism is not about the kind of lone person in the crowd. It's not about the kind of successful, super elite artist or athlete or gifted student. To study perfectionism and to study being perfectionistic is to study everyone. It's relevant to everyone in their everyday lives, including sport. So that's our second myth dealt with, really. So we now have a kind of complex picture of people reporting scores on different dimensions of perfectionism, including standards, including the concerns they have, including the degree to which they impose perfectionist standards on other people. So we've got these kind of variable scores, and we then have these variable scores manifesting in different areas of their lives to different degrees. And our aim at that point is to study the consequences of high levels of perfectionism and low levels of perfectionism and moderate levels of perfectionism in those different areas of their lives, depending on the dimension that's exhibited. So it becomes a quite interesting nexus almost of being perfectionistic. The next myth I want to deal with is perhaps the most common or one of the most common and at least the most dangerous myth, that perfectionism is healthy. We've just seen that perfectionists don't exist, and therefore healthy perfectionists can't exist. I think this myth is based on conceptual confusion, misinterpretation of statistical evidence, and then the misappropriation of methodologies. So people inferring things that they shouldn't really be inferring from the analyses and the designs that they're using. Now, unfortunately, this idea that perfectionism is healthy, or it has a healthy dimension, or exists in healthy types or forms, definitely is evidenced in the literature. So this is one of the first reviews conducted on perfectionism. It was a narrative review, 16 studies focusing on the unique effects of perfectionistic strivings and perfectionistic concerns. And the conclusion was that the findings suggest that only perfectionistic concerns are clearly maladaptive, whereas perfectionistic strivings may form part of a healthy striving for excellence. It was followed up a year later by another study, this time much more systematic, this time 31 studies, 201 correlations, but the conclusion was very similar. Collectively, these findings suggest that perfectionistic strivings are amongst athletes are predominantly adaptive, occasionally neutral, and rarely maladaptive. However, this trend is only apparent when the negative influence of perfectionistic concerns is controlled. That's the second review that concluded the same thing. And then finally, we have a more recent review, 2016, that concluded that super athletes are conscientious, optimistic, hopeful, and perfectionist. And this was based on 6 studies of super elite athletes. And I think, in a nutshell, I think each one of these studies is wrong, and they're wrong for various different reasons. I think there is a quantitative error, and I think there is a qualitative error. The quantitative error is that I think people ignore the fact that there is a quantitative difference between striving for perfection and striving for high or exceptionally high standards. I think the two things are different. And I think there's a qualitative error. I think the motives that underpin striving for perfection are different from the motives that underpin striving for excellence or striving for high or exceptionally high standards. And I'll unpack these two briefly now. So let's talk about the quantitative issue. What I'm arguing here is that there is a difference when you say, I'm pursuing high standards, or I'm pursuing perfectionistic standards. I'm pursuing high goals versus I'm pursuing perfection. And this is illustrated quite nicely by this study, where they simply distributed 2 questionnaires. On one questionnaire, they kept the items, or they had items that made reference to high standards. So you can see here on the left-hand side, I have high standards for my performance at work or at school. I have high expectations for myself. I try to do my best at everything I do. But then on the right-hand side, you see they've adjusted the items to make explicit reference to perfection or being perfect. I have perfectionistic standards for my performance at work or at school. I have expectations of perfection for myself, and I try to be perfect in everything I do. So then I distributed these in three different samples. So these are the findings. So you've got high standards at the top here, APSR, high standards, APSR, perfectionistic standards. And the first thing you should observe is that it's much more common for people to indicate that they're pursuing high standards. The scores are higher for high standards than perfect standards. So it's people are much more more readily able to or will tell you that they have high standards than that they have perfectionistic standards. Now, if you just kind of cast your mind back to what we said about correlations, these are actually a type of correlation. There are beta coefficients. They range from -1 to +1. A positive sign indicates that one variable is going up, the other one's going up, and a negative indicates that one variable is going up, the other one's coming down. So if we just look at HS there, high standards didn't have a significant relationship with depression. High standards didn't have a relationship with anxiety. It did have a positive relationship with life satisfaction, and it had a positive relationship with self-esteem. But if we look at the scale that was amended for perfectionistic strivings, we get quite different findings, right? So you can see perfectionistic striving is positively related to depression, positively related to anxiety, positively related to, negatively related to life satisfaction, and negatively related to self-esteem. It does seem to make a difference. What are we really talking about here? Are we talking about high standards? Are we talking about exceptionally high standards? Or are we talking about perfection? And when we're talking about perfection, I think the consequences are quite different from what the reviews are alluding to. Now, the qualitative error is about underpinning motives, the why. Why are people striving for perfection? And one of the more influential writers on this topic is Thomas Greenspon, who's a very fierce critic of the notion of healthy perfectionism, and argues that the primary motive for perfectionistic striving is really an inability to internalize self-worth. So people who pursue perfection are really pursuing self-worth. They are pursuing a sense of self-acceptance that eludes them. And that can be highly motivational, but it also can confer high levels of motivation, performance, and well-being vulnerabilities. So we found this in our own work. We measured something called conditional self-acceptance. So this is the degree to which people feel like they have to do things, achieve things, behave a certain way in order to be accepted. So we found that perfectionism is positively correlated with conditional self-acceptance in soccer players, kayak and slalom athletes, exercisers, and students. The key issue for me is that people who are scoring high on perfectionism are not pursuing excellence. They are pursuing self-worth. And in that regards, no podium will be high enough for someone who's perfectionistic. An interesting point of comparison is perhaps perfectionism versus conscientiousness. So conscientiousness is about being careful, diligent, organized, hardworking. It's from the big 5 personality characteristics, right? But that is quite different from encouraging people to pursue perfectionism, so perfectionistic striving versus conscientious striving. So we've actually compared self-oriented perfectionism, so imposing perfectionistic standards on yourself and pursuing them, versus conscientious achievement striving. And you can see here we've got a range of correlations from the Hewitt-Flett measure and from the Frost measure, and things like fear of failure, self-criticism, and another measure of perfectionism there. So if we just kind of compare the first 2 red boxes, you see that self-oriented perfectionism is positively related with personal standards from Frost scale. It's positively related with concerns about mistakes. It's not correlated with doubts about action. It's positively correlated with fear of failure, positively correlated with self-criticism. And the final 2 scales there are perfectionistic striving and negative reactions to imperfection. So how negatively you respond when things can't be perfect. But that's quite a different pattern in comparison to conscientious achievement striving. You get the high standards associated with self-oriented perfectionism for conscientious achievement striving, but you don't get the concerns. It's not related to doubt. It's not related to a fear of failure. There is a small correlation with self-criticism. It's still related to perfectionistic strivings, but they don't. It's not related to negative reactions. And you can kind of tease apart why this is the case for self-oriented perfectionism in this next box. And what we actually found is that many of the negative things associated with striving for perfection is kind of is centered on an irrational belief that you should be perfect. So there are irrational beliefs that sit at the center of the striving that they exhibit. So what are the consequences of holding this irrational belief that you should pursue perfection? So this is a study actually conducted by Tracy from her PhD, where we looked at pre-competitive emotions. I think that the consequences of holding these irrational beliefs will manifest in various cognitive, emotional ways, and also have an impact on performance. And we indeed find this, right? So this is a fancy diagram, but if you just look at the diagram on the bottom there, the within-person model, self-oriented perfectionism is positively correlated with perfectionistic cognition, so thinking about perfection, which then leads to higher cognitive anxiety, higher somatic anxiety, more feelings of anger that manifest verbally as well as physically. So there's this thing that we think could be healthy or positive or part of a healthy part of pursuing excellence, or how it was described, I think is actually mobilizing and energizing a very negative pattern of cognition and emotion. We also know from other studies that people who are perfectionistic use certain types of management strategies for the emotions they experience, in particularly suppression. So rather than kind of reappraise and deal with the emotions they have, they tend to hide them from others, which leads to problems over time. So we've got this kind of rise in negative cognitions and rising negative emotions, the inability to deal with them effectively. And for us, one of the major consequences is that the more perfectionistic you are, the more likely you are to burn out. Because burnout is a stress-related syndrome that develops over time. And this is a meta-analysis that we did a while ago now. 43 studies, over 10,000 people, 663 effects. And you tend to find either a positive correlation for perfectionistic concerns or a correlation for perfectionistic striving that doesn't exceed publication bias. So it tends to have no effect. So you've got this kind of complex picture of emotions, coping, and stress and burnout. Yeah, and as I said, we found this relationship in a whole range of different studies and samples. The one thing that people like to raise is that perfectionism tends to be related to higher performance, or perfectionistic striving does at least, and that is definitely the case. Okay, there is evidence in the literature that people who report higher levels of perfectionistic striving do also sometimes report higher athletic performance. So this is a study by Daniel Madigan that I was involved in that just found that perfectionistic striving was positively related to a basketball task there, 0.38. And we also know why this is partly the case. It's partly the case because perfectionistic striving seems to be related to the idea that you should outperform others and you are able to outperform others. So it leads to this kind of achievement goal that encourages better performance. We've also found it in more complex circumstances. So we know that perfectionism can also mobilize team performance. So this is a study I did a while ago looking at perfectionism in boats. And so it's a little bit more complex because you have perfectionism at individual level manifest in a boat, and then we monitored their performance across 4 days to see if more perfectionistic boats perform better. And what we found is that the more self-oriented perfectionism in the boat and the more team perfectionism in the boat, the more you demanded of others, the better they performed, right? So I'm not trying to suggest to you that people who are perfectionistic aren't able of producing high levels of performance. They are. But for me, there's a really important caveat. And that caveat is I think perfectionism makes them vulnerable to difficulties when they encounter achievement setbacks. So this is a study that we did in a lab. We had student athletes come into the lab, get on a cycle ergometer, and cycle as fast and as far as they could in 4 minutes, and then we measured psychological variables in between three goes. So you can see on the screen what they would have seen. So they had the target that they set themselves in 4 minutes, the distance travelled, the amount of time, and the RPM. Now the key thing in this study is that we manipulated the feedback that they received, and no matter how hard they tried, they always were told that they failed. Okay, they always were told that they failed, and we just measured what happened. And on screen here, you can see that we measured threat, and we've got two groups here. We've got the group who were higher in self-oriented perfectionism, and the group that were lower in self-oriented perfectionism. And you've got pre-trial threat. How threatened do you feel right now about your performance? And then we've got pre-trial 2 threat. How threatened do you feel now, having failed your first go? And you can see what happens to the high self-oriented perfectionism group. Threat increases significantly for that group after one failure. Okay. We also measured effort. How hard did you try on that trial? And you can see what happens to the high self-oriented perfectionism group. They tell us they withdraw effort. They stop trying after experiencing one failure. Now, this doesn't seem like a very adaptive strategy, particularly when you think about it as a very contrived task in a lab rather than in a real-world meaningful task. So this was the first indication we had really in sport that perfectionism might be a vulnerability factor in a performance setting. We then followed this up with another study. This time, rather than racing against themselves, they raced against other people. So we had 4 people come into the lab. We set up the bikes perpendicular, and we measured the emotional experiences associated with performance. And again, it was very similar to the first study, 4-minute trials. But what we did is we told each one of them they came last, and we measured the effects. So you can see here at group level, this is for everyone. When you get told that you come last, you get a dip in pride, you get an increase in shame, and you get an increase in guilt, but it tends to plateau. That's for everyone. So then we asked the question, what happened if you were higher in self-oriented perfectionism and higher in socially prescribed perfectionism? These fancy graphs tell us this, that the higher you are in self-oriented perfectionism and the higher you are in socially prescribed perfectionism, the more acute or elevated the shame you experience is. So perfectionism seems to be, or it seems to trigger a much stronger emotional response that's characterized by higher levels of shame. It's also the same for guilt. They experience more guilt the higher you are in socially prescribed perfectionism and self-oriented perfectionism. So we get threat, we get changes in effort, we get more or an interesting pattern of self-conscious emotions. And more recently, I was involved in a study looking at performance after failure. And the fascinating thing about this study was that after experiencing failure initially, higher perfectionistic striving predicted better performance after an initial failure. But as perfectionistic concerns increased, that effect disappeared and eventually became negative. So striving for perfectionism eventually had a negative impact on performance after experiencing failure. So we got this, it's a very complex pattern of behavior that follows failure. So what should you do? You've got reviews that are telling you that striving for perfectionism could be healthy, and then you've got this more complex picture of events that are taking place. And I think you have to weigh the evidence. What is more likely given what we know about perfectionism? And what we know about perfectionism outside of sport, I think, is really compelling. And sport is really lagging behind research outside of sport, particularly for psychological and physical health. At last count, there are 408 studies looking at perfectionism and various psychopathologies, eating disorders, suicide ideation, attempts at suicide, depression, and various other things that illustrate that perfectionistic concerns and perfectionistic strivings are positively correlated to these things to some degree. There is no evidence that perfectionistic striving is a good thing in the research that's looked at psychological health. And an emerging picture from a physical health perspective, we know that perfectionism is related to the occurrence or the increased occurrence of some physical ill health. That includes kind of psychosomatic symptoms, chronic fatigue, and various other illnesses. But perhaps most compelling in this area of research is that we know once a chronic illness and a disability occurs, people who are perfectionistic have more difficulty dealing with it and coping with it. It's a very different experience for people who are high in perfectionism. So for me, it is at best premature to conclude that perfectionism would in some way be something we would want to encourage in athletes. And at worst, I think we need to remind ourselves of being conservative and the kind of indirect consequences of encouraging something that we know is highly problematic outside of sport. And for me, there is no reason why sport would be a protective factor for those consequences. But I'm aware I'm running out of time, so I'll just do this one quickly. The last myth is that everything's going to be okay. That there's nothing we need to do about this. And for me, there is. Now, we recently examined the changes in perfectionism in young people over time. So 164 studies, 21,000 students, 1989 to 2016. And because the same instruments are being distributed, you can track the changes in perfectionism across that period of time. And we found that other-orientated perfectionism is increasing in young people. Self-orientated perfectionism is increasing in young people. And most scarily, socially prescribed perfectionism, the dimension that's most related to mental ill health, is also increasing, and more so than the other dimensions. Young people now are much more perfectionistic than they were 25 years ago. And what does this mean in real terms? It means that in 1989, about 10% of young people were in a category that people have argued where perfectionism could be clinically relevant. So they might not necessarily be experiencing any mental ill health. They're certainly vulnerable to it. In 2016, that had almost doubled to 18%. And because we've got a nice graph and we can plot it over time, we know in 2033 and 2037 we'll be approaching a third of young people will be exhibiting perfectionism in this kind of clinically relevant category. Why is this important for us in sport? Well, lots of young people obviously enter sport, and we know there's already evidence that some mental disorders are overrepresented in athletic populations. And I think this is not going to go away. And I think it reiterates the importance of understanding perfectionism and its potential consequences, not just in sport, but in a number of different achievement contexts. So our athletes won't be exempt from those increases. And we've kind of speculated on some of the societal changes that mean that perfectionism might be increasing. So the focus on kind of individual competitiveness, meritocracy, changes in individual culture, changes in parental behaviours, and many of these can also be seen in sport. Sport is arguably never been more competitive than it is now. It's never been more demanding, never been more lucrative, and has never been more characterised by a sense of perfectionistic pressure. So I would anticipate that we will see increases in perfectionistic problems in sport over the next 5 to 10 years. So I'm running 5 minutes slightly over time, and hopefully I haven't gotten too fast. But just to summarise, when we're talking about perfectionism, we're talking about a range of characteristics. We're talking about people exhibiting those characteristics to different degrees and different domains. We're not talking about something that I think is healthy, in my opinion. I think we're talking about something that is very complex, that needs to be studied prospectively across time to better understand the emotions and behaviours that athletes exhibit. And I think it's something that's going to become increasingly important in sport, particularly in regards to mental health. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for listening. And then also thank you to the various different organisations that have funded this and other research of the group. I'll stop sharing now and I'll go back to Tracy, I believe.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andy. That was so informative. Even being a perfectionism researcher, I always learn when Andy talks. I've got a question here from a teacher and also as a running coach. And the question's around the talk about growth mindset in schools and wondering if this is pushing children to be more perfectionistic striving. And are we setting up our young people to believe that effort will lead directly to success? And therefore, are we encouraging a socially prescribed perfectionistic mindset in young people?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. Like, I think, kind of the first is I'll break it down. So is perfectionism relevant to schools? Definitely. Is it relevant to the classroom? Yes. Do we see similar effects? We definitely do see similar effects. In many ways, there's a lot less evidence for the context having a major impact than just kind of translating. We'll expect perfectionism to lead to student burnout, for example, to pre-anxiety emotions for exams. So you see very similar patterns emerging in a school context. The mindset stuff is really interesting. Like the kind of growth versus fixed mindset. It's definitely more complex. The ideas are really nice and simple. The kind of the idea that some people believe that ability is fixed and some people believe that it's about effort. The problem with simplicity is sometimes it's a kind of little bit misleading because as that person is alluded to there, are we setting these guys up for kind of setting them up for problems like we know that effort in and of itself is not enough, right? We know that, and by kind of teaching children or young people that effort is enough. In some ways, we may be kind of setting them up for kind of vulnerability factors, or vulnerability issues. Like, I think the best thing possibly to do is to think about it as regulation. Effort over time. Like, so rather than teaching kind of growth mindset, it's better to teach people how to deal with inevitable failure. That's probably the better thing. To teach them that failure is inevitable and teach them to fail well. Teach them that it's okay and it's normal, as opposed to if I just try really hard, I'm going to be successful. I'm not aware of any research that has looked at mindset and perfectionism, but it probably does exist. I mean, if I was to speculate, perfectionism tends to be highly correlated with all kinds of motivational factors. So I imagine perfectionism would probably be positively correlated with both the belief that you can try really hard to be successful and that the ability is fixed. In the same way it's correlated with ego and task orientation, in the same way that it's correlated with intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. It's just a very highly motivational construct. So I rambled on for ages there as I was trying to collect my thoughts, but I think it's a really difficult question, like to unpack. But I do like Carol Dweck, the simplicity of the Carol Dweck approach. But we know that kind of self-regulation is probably a better focus, in my opinion, for safeguarding motivation over time than just instilling static beliefs and hoping things will take care of themselves over time.
Great. And we've got a question from Sam. Sam, do you want to ask on the mic? Do you want me to read it?
I was just wondering what led you into perfectionism as an area of research, really, at the
Yeah,
beginning.
yeah. So my supervisor was Professor Howard Hall, who was one of the first people to write about perfectionism and its relevance in sport. I mean, he was my supervisor, so I came to it in a in a timely way, but also I said that kind of perfectionism has a resonance in sport, and I think it has a resonance with a lot of people. I think a lot of people kind of recognise perfectionistic qualities in themselves or other people, and so certainly I think that's the case for me as well. I recognise perfectionistic qualities, or had recognised perfectionistic qualities in myself and other people. So I think it's kind of it definitely has a resonance with me trying to understand perfectionism and what it might lead to.
That was the second part of Sam's question, so you've just answered it. Basically, are you perfectionistic yourself?
Yeah, I try not to be. I try not to be. But if we think about the myths, everyone exhibits perfectionism to some degree in some domains. So kind of no one, or it would be rarer to find someone who wasn't perfectionistic in any area of their life. It just depends in the consequences just depend on to what degree and to what domain. But in some ways, maybe much like sport encourages perfectionism, I think maybe academia and kind of education settings encourage perfectionism to some degree.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a question from Oliver. Do you want to ask it, Oliver? Olivier?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm especially interested in the distinction between like perfectionism and high standards. And my question was, how can we help or how can we support people, individual athletes or young academics to strive for high standards rather than perfection?
Yeah, yeah. So I think you have to ask yourself, what is the difference between high standards and perfectionistic standards? Perfectionistic standards are much more rigid, much more dictonymous, much more extreme, unnecessary. Whereas high standards, or even exceptionally high standards, may be considered more reasonable and realistic, given the ability, given the circumstances you find yourself in. They're certainly much more flexible. But if we want to move beyond standards and talk about perfectionism, the best thing I could say is the distinction is what are people thinking and feeling when they don't achieve those standards, and that's where I think the applied and intervention work is. Perfectionism and the kind of engine room for the debilitation that they experience is the harsh self-criticism and anxiety they experience when things don't go well, and that's the stuff that's absent from a more healthy approach to achievement striving. So I think the focus needs to be on addressing irrational beliefs that underpin the strivings in the first place. You will be able to give people kind of tools to identify perfectionistic thoughts, manage the emotions that are associated with being perfectionistic. But if you want to address perfectionism, I think you have to get at what Thomas Greenspan was arguing, which is why do some people or why are some people unable to internalize a stable sense of self-esteem? And depending on your kind of philosophical approach, you might end up talking about things like rational emotive behavior therapy and Albert Ellis's kind of framework, which I think Albert Ellis is one of the earliest people to write about perfectionism in the way that we recognize now as one of a number of irrational beliefs that people carry with them, that there are perfect solutions to problems and you should find those perfect solutions. Is that helpful, Oliver?
Yeah, thank you very, very much for this detailed response, or just like more theoretical interest in the difference, but also how to translate that into practice. So more
yeah,
good.
Yeah, there are a small number of studies that have looked at effectiveness of interventions in sports. Amber Moswich has illustrated that a self-compassionate approach can reduce perfectionism. There's some evidence of self-help books that are based on CBT. That Tracy did that as part of her PhD. We're currently looking at different approaches. Dean Watson, one of my other PhD students, will probably talk about that later. We've looked at kind of using single subject, multiple baseline studies just to see how effective other approaches are. Interestingly, we've found very little evidence that kind of traditional psychological skills training reduces perfectionism. It doesn't appear to at this point. So you'll find a small number of studies in sport. There's a large number of studies outside of sport in a clinical context, and mainly that they've been CBT based, and mainly they support the efficacy of CBT in reducing perfectionism.